February 1945. The Belgian forest is not a place of peace. It is a place where winter has turned brutal, where pine trees stand like silent witnesses, and the snow beneath them tells a story that the world would spend decades trying to forget. On this night, in the darkness of a war-torn forest, something impossible happens, something that will echo through history with a question that refuses to be answered. The nurses had arrived weeks earlier, 36 American women, trained, dedicated, brave beyond measure, assigned to the 121st Evacuation Hospital, deep in the heart of the European theater. They were not soldiers, yet they bore witness to the horrors of war every single day. They held the hands of dying men. They stitched wounds that refused to close. They whispered comfort in languages born from their own fear and faith. These were women who had made a choice. While their brothers went to war with guns, these sisters chose to go with bandages. While others were told to stay safe at home, they volunteered to run into the places where safety had ceased to exist. They were nurses, healers, protectors, the backbone of every field hospital that kept soldiers alive long enough to see home again. But on this particular night, everything changed. The Germans were advancing faster than anyone had anticipated. The Allies were retreating in disarray. The front lines were collapsing like dominoes knocked over by an invisible hand. And the nurses, these women in their starched white uniforms, badges of mercy in a world of metal and blood, found themselves trapped in the path of an unstoppable force. What happened in those dark hours remains fractured across history like broken glass. The records are incomplete. The testimonies conflict. The official reports contradict each other. But what we know is undeniable. The camp was attacked. Panic spread like a contagion through the tents. Soldiers screamed. Officers barked orders that no one could hear over the sound of explosions and gunfire. In the confusion, in the smoke and the shouting and the terror, dozens of American nurses simply vanished. Not in the way soldiers vanish, honored, documented, their names carved into memorials and whispered in prayers at sunrise. No, these women disappeared like ghosts, like shadows that daylight had swallowed whole, like they had never existed at all. 36 women went into that forest 2 years earlier. The war was still young and America still believed it could end by Christmas. New York Harbor, 1943. The morning broke cold and clear, the kind of morning that makes you feel like anything is possible. The docks were alive with movement. Soldiers in pressed uniforms, families clutching the hands of their sons, mothers holding back tears they had promised themselves they would not shed. Ships loomed like metal cathedrals against the sky, their hulls painted gray for war, their decks crowded with the machinery of conflict, and among them walked the nurses. They moved in clusters, their uniforms pristine, their hair carefully pinned, their leather bags held tight against their chests. Some walked with confidence. Others moved as if they were still trying to convince themselves that this moment was real. All of them carried the same quiet determination, the knowledge that they had signed up for something larger than themselves. Grace Holloway stood on the dock, watching the ship that would carry her across an ocean she had never crossed. She was 32 years old, with kind eyes and calloused hands that had spent a decade in hospital wards back in Philadelphia. She had read the recruitment posters. She had seen the photographs of wounded soldiers in field hospitals overwhelmed beyond capacity, and she had made a choice that her mother still could not understand. "You're really going through with this," her mother had said 3 weeks earlier, sitting in their kitchen over untouched coffee. Grace had taken her mother's hand. "Ma, they need us. People are dying, and they need people who know how to help them. I can do that. I have to." Her mother had cried then, not the proud cry of a parent sending her child off to greatness, but the deep, aching cry of a woman terrified she would never see her daughter again. Next to Grace stood Ann Carter, younger by 5 years, with dark hair and an infectious laugh that seemed incongruous for a woman about to enter a war zone. Ann came from Boston money. Her father was a banker, her mother a socialite, and everyone had wondered why she would trade her comfortable life for canvas tents and blood-soaked sheets. But Ann had her own reasons that ran deeper than patriotism or duty. "Look at them all," Ann whispered, gesturing to the throngs of soldiers boarding the ship. "They're just boys. Most of them look like they should still be in school." Grace nodded. She had seen the same thing in the hospitals back home. Young men pretending to be soldiers, pretending to be brave, their fear barely hidden beneath the uniform. "We're going to take care of them," Grace said quietly. It was not a question. It was a promise she was making to herself as much as to Anne. The band played patriotic music. People cheered. Letters were waved in the air one last time before the ships pulled away from the dock. Mothers pressed themselves against the metal railings, watching their sons disappear into the horizon. Sweetheart stood frozen, hands raised in gestures they hoped would travel across the distance. Grace and Anne stood together on the deck, watching America shrink behind them. Neither of them knew what awaited them across the Atlantic. Neither of them could have imagined what the next 2 years would hold. The horrors they would witness, the lives they would save, the bonds of sisterhood they would forge with the women around them. They believed they were going to heal. They believed they would come home. They did not know that Europe would never let them go. Fort Sam Houston, Texas, summer 1943. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, turning the training grounds into something resembling an oven. Sweat soaked through uniforms before breakfast was finished. The instructors barked orders that seemed designed not just to teach, but to break, to strip away any remaining softness and replace it with the hardened resolve needed to survive what was coming. By 1943, the United States Army Nurse Corps had already mobilized over 60,000 women, 60,000 women who had answered a call that most people thought unthinkable, women who had left their homes, their families, their comfortable lives, to do work that civilian hospitals considered too dangerous, too traumatic, too psychologically damaging for their nurses to endure. And now they had to be prepared. Only a handful came out. The ones who survived spoke in fragmented sentences, their voices trembling, their eyes haunted by something they could never fully articulate. They spoke of being separated in the darkness, of running through snow so deep it pulled at their legs like hands trying to drag them down, of choices made in mere seconds that determined who lived and who didn't. Some said they were captured by German soldiers. Others believed their sisters had simply been swallowed by the chaos, by the fog of war, by the forest, by the cruelty of a conflict that had already stolen so much from so many. But here is the true mystery that haunts us even now. Despite the most extensive searches ever mounted by the military, despite investigations that stretched across years and continents, despite Red Cross inquiries and dedicated historians combing through the wreckage of war with meticulous precision, the women were never found. No remains, no traces, no final answers, no graves to mark, no bodies to bury, nothing but silence. The world moved on. The war ended. Monuments were built to honor the soldiers who fell. Parades filled the streets to celebrate the generals who commanded. History books were written, and the sacrifices of millions were recorded in careful, methodical detail. Medals were distributed. Stories were told around dinner tables. Grandchildren listened with wide eyes as their grandfathers recounted tales of bravery and survival. But the nurses, the women who had sworn to heal, to comfort, to bring humanity into the most inhuman of places, the women who had saved lives with their own hands, who had wiped tears and blood from broken faces, who had been the last familiar voice some men ever heard before they closed their eyes for the final time. They were forgotten. The war would remember its soldiers, men who fought with rifles and rage, men whose stories filled the history books. But it would forget its angels. The women who chose compassion in a world that had abandoned it. The women who answered the call when others turned away. The women whose names were slowly erased from the collective memory of a grateful nation. This is their story. This is the story of the nurses who vanished. And this is a question that demands an answer. Who were these women, and how did angels disappear in a war of men? Grace stood in a canvas tent, her hands trembling slightly as she held a tourniquet. Around her, 15 other nurses practiced the same movements, over and over until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. The instructor, a battle-hardened sergeant with a scar running down his left cheek, watched with cold precision. "You're too slow, Holloway," he called out. "On the battlefield, your hesitation kills. A man bleeds out in 3 minutes if you don't stop the hemorrhage. 3 minutes. That's all you get." Grace worked faster, her fingers moving with mechanical efficiency. She had learned to push down the fear, to channel it into focus. Around her, the other nurses did the same, their faces set, their expressions hardened by the knowledge of what awaited them. At Camp Dix in New Jersey, another group of nurses learned triage, the brutal calculus of war medicine. Who could be saved? Who was beyond saving? Who should be prioritized? The instructors presented scenarios that grew progressively more horrific. A soldier with massive head trauma, a man whose legs were gone, 3 casualties arriving simultaneously with varying degrees of injury. What do you do? Who do you choose? Anne sat in the classroom, her notebook filled with careful notes, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. She was thinking about what it would mean to make these choices in real time, to look into the eyes of a dying man and tell him he had to wait, because someone else was more likely to survive, to carry that weight for the rest of her life. The gas mask drills were perhaps the most terrifying. Nurses donned the protective masks and worked in a chamber where a harmless but irritating gas was released. The panic came first, the sensation of suffocation, of the world becoming muffled and distorted, of not being able to trust your own senses. But they had to work through it. They had to practice treating patients while wearing the masks. Because if the Germans used chemical weapons, there would be no luxury of panic. Grace's hands shook as she tried to insert an IV line through the rubber gloves of the protective suit. Everything was clumsy. Everything felt impossible. The instructor's voice came through the mask like a ghost's whisper. Again, you do this until you can do it in your sleep. By late summer, the reality had fully settled into their bones. These were not nurses preparing for a medical mission. These were soldiers, women soldiers, being trained for war. The Army Nurse Corps manuals were distributed to all personnel. The historical record was clear. Nurses in combat zones had a casualty rate of 1 in every 400. It was not a number designed to comfort anyone. And then came the orders. The envelope was sealed, stamped with official insignia. When Grace opened it, her breath caught. The words seemed to swim before her eyes. Report for overseas deployment. Destination Normandy. Departure date May 15, 1944. Around her, other nurses were opening their own envelopes. Some wept quietly. Others sat in stunned silence. Anne found Grace in the barracks that evening and simply held her hand. No words were necessary. They both understood what this meant. The training was over. The real war was about to begin. June 1944, Normandy. The beach was not a beach, it was a graveyard, pretending to be solid ground. The nurses arrived 3 days after the initial landings, transported on a medical ship that bucked through waters still stained with blood and diesel fuel. As they approached the shore, the sound hit them first. Not the sound of waves or seagulls, but the sound of war itself. Artillery fire that rattled your teeth, the constant percussion of machine gun fire, the distant wail of incoming aircraft, and beneath it all, the screaming. Grace gripped the ship's railing as they moved closer to the beach. Her training had prepared her for many things, but nothing could have prepared her for this. The reality was not like the exercises at Fort Sam Houston. The reality had a smell. Blood mixed with cordite, diesel fuel, human waste, and something else she could not name. The reality had a temperature. The reality had weight. The canvas hospital tent had been hastily erected on the edge of the beach, less than a mile from active fighting. The moment the nurses arrived, before they had even set down their bags, the wounded began to pour in. Not in organized waves, not in manageable numbers, but in a relentless, suffocating flood. They came on stretchers held by exhausted soldiers. They came crawling, dragging themselves through the dirt with determination born from survival instinct. They came on carts and makeshift gurneys and in the arms of their brothers in arms who refused to leave them behind. Some were conscious. Many were not. All of them were broken. Grace moved through the tent like someone in a fever dream. Hands, so many hands, reached out from the canvas cots. Voices called in different languages. A man with shrapnel embedded in his chest gasped her name, though they had never met. A boy who looked 16 tried to sit up despite having no legs below the knees. Plasma. "I need plasma," she heard someone shouting. It was her own voice. Anne's hands moved with mechanical precision, tourniquets and bandages and inventory checks. But her mind was fracturing. Around her, nurses who had been her sisters just hours ago were moving with expressions of shock and trauma already settling into their features. One nurse, a woman named Patricia from Minnesota, simply stood frozen over a patient, her eyes unseeing, her hands trembling. That night, by the light of a hurricane lamp, Anne wrote in her diary. Her handwriting was shaky, the words barely legible. June 7th, 1944. I don't know where to begin. I don't know how to explain what we saw today. We thought we were ready. The training was thorough. The instructors were strict. But nothing in the world could have prepared us for this. I held a man's hand as he died. He was 22 years old. He kept asking for his mother. I told him she was there with him, that she was holding his hand, that everything was going to be all right. It was all lies. Every word was a lie. But I kept saying them because what else could I do? Grace found me after midnight sitting outside the tent. She didn't say anything. She just sat next to me in the darkness and we listened to the distant sound of artillery. I think we both understood that we had left something important behind on that transport ship. We had left behind the people we were before we saw what war actually looks like. Tomorrow the casualties will continue. There will be more wounded, more dying. More men who need us to be strong when strength feels like a luxury we cannot afford. I don't know if I can do this, but I know I have to. The morning came gray and wet. Rain began to fall. Not soft rain, but heavy, relentless rain that turned the ground into mud. The wounded kept arriving. The nurses kept working. The war did not pause for weather or exhaustion or the fragile human mind reaching its breaking point. By afternoon, the routine had settled into something almost mechanical. Assess, treat, move to the next patient. Assess, treat, move to the next. Grace was wrapping a chest wound. When she heard it, a sound different from all the other sounds of war. A high-pitched whistle growing louder, coming closer. She looked up just in time to see Anne's face register the same recognition. An incoming shell. The world went white. Then the tent exploded. The tent did not collapse. It tore. Shrapnel ripped through the canvas like angry claws, and for a moment, the nurses stood frozen, still alive, still breathing, still standing in a space where death had been milliseconds away. Grace pulled herself up from the ground, her ears ringing, her vision blurred. Around her, patients called out. Some were crying. Others had gone silent in that particular way that meant they had already left their bodies behind. She moved to the nearest cot. A young man, barely 20, was bleeding from a wound on his side that had reopened in the blast. His eyes were unfocused, searching for something just beyond his reach. "You're going to be okay," Grace whispered, her hands already working. "Just stay with me." As night fell, the artillery quieted. Not stopped, war does not stop, but lessened, as if even the guns needed to rest. The nurses moved through the tent with movements that had become automatic. Bandage. Check vitals. Move to the next patient. Repeat. Anne sat by a cot in the far corner where they had placed a man who had arrived an hour earlier. He was German. A pilot, judging by the insignia on his torn uniform. His Messerschmitt had been shot down somewhere over the channel, and he had survived the crash only to be pulled from the water by American soldiers. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. A deep wound ran along his ribs. Shrapnel or bullets, it was impossible to tell. He drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring words in German that Anne could not understand. She cleaned the wound carefully, her fingers gentle despite her exhaustion. Around them, the sounds of war continued, distant thunder, the occasional burst of gunfire, the low murmur of voices speaking in military shorthand. Grace found Anne there near midnight. "You're wasting supplies on a German," Grace said quietly. There was no accusation in her voice, only observation. Anne did not look up from her work. "He's a patient. He's the enemy, is he?" Anne finally looked at her friend, and there was something broken in her expression. Something that the last few days had fractured beyond repair. "Look at him, Grace. He's someone's son. He's someone's brother. He's someone who probably didn't want to be in this war any more than we did." Grace pulled up a chair and sat beside Anne. The German pilot's eyes flickered open for a moment. He looked at them, two American nurses in their blood-stained uniforms, and something like gratitude crossed his face before consciousness slipped away again. "My mother used to read me prayers," Grace said, her voice barely audible above the ambient sounds of the hospital. "Every night before bed. I haven't thought about those prayers in years." She reached down and took the pilot's hand, not as a nurse checking his pulse, but as a human being offering comfort to another human being. "Our Father who art in heaven," she whispered, "hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." Anne joined in, their voices intertwining, creating something sacred in a place that had been consumed by the profane. Around them, other patients stirred. Some listened. Some slipped deeper into unconsciousness. The sounds of war continued, a constant percussion underneath their prayers. A reminder that peace was a luxury that did not exist in this place. A soldier, an American with bandages wrapped around his head, began to mouth the words along with them. Then another, until the entire tent was filled with the whispered recitation of a prayer that had survived wars and centuries and human cruelty. When it ended, there was a moment of profound silence. Grace squeezed the German pilot's hand. He was still breathing, still fighting, still here. Just let tomorrow come, she whispered to the darkness. It was not quite a prayer. It was something more desperate than that. It was a plea, a bargain with a universe that had proven itself indifferent to human suffering. Just let us see tomorrow. Outside, the artillery rumbled in the distance like the heartbeat of something vast and angry and unstoppable. Inside the tent, the nurses kept watch through the night, holding hands, wiping foreheads, whispering the same prayer over and over, hoping that God was listening, knowing that even if he was, he seemed powerless to stop what was coming. February 14th, 1945. 8 months had passed since the tent explosion. 8 months of constantly moving, constantly treating, constantly losing patients despite everything they did to save them. The 121st Evacuation Hospital had relocated 17 times. They had seen the war move across the landscape like a living thing, advancing, retreating, advancing again. And the nurses had moved with it, their youth evaporating with each passing day. Their eyes taking on the hollow quality of people who had seen too much to ever be innocent again. By mid-February, the Germans were launching their final, desperate offensive. The Ardennes had already fallen. The Allies were pushing eastward, closer to German territory, closer to Berlin. The front lines were fluid and chaotic, held by nobody for more than a few hours before being abandoned or recaptured or obliterated by artillery fire. The decision came down from command. Evacuate the hospital. Move the wounded to a more secure location, away from the advancing Germans. It was standard procedure. It had been done a dozen times before, but this time something was different. The fog had rolled in thick and suffocating. The kind of fog that reduced visibility to mere yards, that swallowed sound and made distances impossible to judge. Grace loaded supplies into one of the convoy trucks, her movements automatic after so many months of repetition. Around her, other nurses did the same. The column would consist of 4 heavy transport trucks carrying supplies and non-ambulatory patients, 3 smaller vehicles for the nurses and medics, and 2 jeeps for security. 18 people in total, 16 nurses, a chaplain, and a driver. Anne found Grace just before they were about to depart. I have a bad feeling about this, Anne said quietly. They had learned over the months to trust these feelings. They were not based on logic or training. They were based on something deeper, a primal instinct honed by survival. It's just fog, Grace replied, but her voice was uncertain. We've driven through worse, have we? Anne looked at her friend, and in her eyes was a question that neither of them could answer. The convoy assembled on the narrow Belgian road at 0600 hours. The fog was so thick that the truck in front was barely visible to the truck behind. Orders were given. Maintain visual contact, keep the pace slow and steady, radio check-in every 15 minutes. The first radio transmission crackled through at 0615. Convoy moving. All clear. Visibility poor but manageable. At 0630. Proceeding on Route 7. No contact with enemy. At 0645. Road ahead appears clear. Continuing evacuation route. Grace sat in the middle truck, watching the fog press against the canvas sides like a living thing trying to push its way in. Around her, nurses sat in tense silence. Some read letters from home. Others stared at nothing. Anne sat across from her, their eyes meeting briefly. An acknowledgement that they were both thinking the same thing. That this did not feel right. At 0700 hours, the radio crackled again. There's movement ahead. Can't quite make it out through the static, then nothing. The convoy commander waited, counting seconds that felt like hours. Lead vehicle, respond. Lead vehicle, come in. More static. Just the white noise of dead air and distance and something terrible happening in the fog where no one could see. All units maintain position. Stand by. The fog continued to swallow everything. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then 2. When the forward scout vehicles finally penetrated the fog the next morning, what they found defied easy explanation. The 4 transport trucks were still on the road, but burned, completely incinerated. The metal frames twisted into grotesque shapes, black char coating everything. The smell of burned diesel and something else, something organic and horrifying, hanging in the cold air. But the nurses were gone, not wounded, not captured and marched away at gunpoint, not lying dead in the wreckage, simply absent, vanished like ghosts, like the fog itself had pulled them into whatever dimension it occupied. The investigation that followed was chaotic and incomplete. The military brass seemed more interested in moving forward than in looking back. Some soldiers reported hearing gunfire in the fog. Others claimed they heard engines that didn't belong to American vehicles. A few whispered about seeing German uniforms in the distance, but no one had concrete answers. No one had proof. No one had bodies. 16 American nurses, 1 chaplain, 1 driver, 18 people who drove into the fog on a Belgian road in February 1945, and from that road, no one ever came back. The search began immediately. Not in an organized, systematic way, but in the frantic, desperate manner of people who know they are running out of time. If the nurses had been captured, if they were alive somewhere in the German-held territories, every hour was precious. Every moment of delay could mean the difference between rescue and tragedy. Search teams moved through the Belgian forest with dogs and metal detectors. They were looking for anything: bodies, personal effects, evidence of what had transpired in that fog. The forest was dense and unforgiving, the undergrowth thick, the winter having turned everything into a landscape of browns and grays. It was a soldier named Marcus Webb, from Tennessee, who found the first piece of evidence 3 days into the search. A locket, silver tarnished by weather and time. It lay half buried in the pine needles at the edge of a ravine, the chain still intact. When Webb opened it carefully, his breath caught. Inside were 2 photographs, a mother and father, their faces frozen in that formal way of the 1920s, looking out at a world they could not have imagined their daughter entering. On the back, an inscription in careful handwriting, to Grace on her graduation. With all our love. The locket was marked with the serial number of a piece of standard-issue military jewelry. Grace Holloway, 28 years old, registered nurse, missing in action, presumed captured or deceased. The discovery sent ripples through the investigation. If she had gone over the ravine, they reasoned, the others might have as well. The search teams intensified their efforts, probing deeper into the forest, calling out names that echoed off the trees and received no answer. Then they found the watch. It was caught on a branch about 200 yards from where the locket had been discovered. A military-issue wristwatch, its face cracked but still readable. The seconds hand had stopped. The time preserved forever. 03:17, 3:17 in the morning. The middle of the night. The middle of the fog. The moment perhaps when everything ended. The military leadership convened. Without bodies, without clear evidence of death, they could not declare the nurses deceased. They were classified as missing in action, presumed captured. The paperwork was filed, the investigations continued, and the machinery of war ground forward. But in the small villages surrounding the forest, people remembered. They remembered things that the official reports did not include. An elderly woman named Marie, who lived in a cottage near the road, came forward. She spoke hesitantly at first, as if unsure whether what she had seen was real, or a fever dream born from the trauma of living under occupation. She had been awake that night. A German patrol had passed her cottage, and she had watched from her window in the darkness. Behind the soldiers, she said, there was a group of women. They were wearing white coats, hospital uniforms, though the white had been stained with mud and ash. They were walking, not running. They were not dragging their feet in resistance. They were simply walking into the forest, into the darkness, into whatever lay beyond the reach of rescue. Another villager, a farmer named Thomas, corroborated her account. He had been on the road that night trying to move cattle away from the conflict zone. He too had seen the column. He too had seen the armed German soldiers herding the women deeper into the woods, away from the main road, away from any place where the Allies might find them. The testimonies were inconsistent in some details. Accounts of war often are, but consistent in their essential element. American nurses, in their white uniforms, being led into the forest by German forces. Some villagers said they heard gunfire. Others said they heard nothing. Some claimed the women were singing as they walked, hymns, prayers, songs of defiance. Others said they walked in silence, their fate already written in the darkness around them. One old man who had lost his own son in the war spoke with particular certainty. He had followed the column at a distance, compelled by something he could not name to bear witness. He described them moving deeper and deeper into the woods, the fog growing thicker, the German soldiers' footsteps growing fainter, until finally there was only silence. He was the only person who claimed to have seen where they ultimately went. According to his account, they were taken to a facility, a camp of some kind hidden deep in the forest, a place where the rules of the Geneva Convention did not apply, a place where women in white coats could disappear and no one would ever ask questions. Some said they saw a column of prisoners moving through that camp in the weeks that followed. They said the prisoners were women. They said they were still wearing white. The war ended on May 7, 1945, 3 months after the nurses vanished into the Belgian forest. In the months and years that followed, the machinery of official investigation lurched forward with all the speed of bureaucratic procedure. The United States military had protocols for missing personnel, forms to be filled, reports to be filed, families to be notified, but the nurses of the 121st Evacuation Hospital did not fit neatly into those protocols. In 1945, the United States Army Nurse Corps had mobilized over 200,000 women. Of those, approximately 200 had been killed in action or died in service. 68 had been captured or were missing in action. The statistics were published in official reports, sanitized and organized, transformed into numbers that told no story of individual human loss. The families received letters. Official letters typed on military letterhead, signed by commanding officers who had never met the nurses in question. The language was careful, measured, designed to convey information without conveying emotion. Dear Mrs. Holloway, it is with deep regret that I inform you of the missing status of your daughter, Lieutenant Grace Holloway, Army serial number redacted, who was reported missing in action on February 14, 1945, in the European Theater of Operations. She is presumed to have been captured or killed in action. The United States Army expresses its sincerest condolences, but the families wanted more than official language. They wanted answers. They wanted to know what had happened. They wanted to bring their daughters home. Grace's mother, Eleanor Holloway, wrote letter after letter to the War Department. Her handwriting grew shakier with each one, the physical manifestation of hope gradually being replaced by despair. My daughter went to heal the wounded. She risked everything to help others. I am begging you, please tell me what happened to her. Please tell me where she is. I don't care if she is a prisoner. I don't care if she is wounded. I just need to know that she is alive. I just need to know that she did not die alone in a foreign country without anyone there to hold her hand. Eleanor never received a satisfactory answer. Anne's father, Robert Carter, took a different approach. He had connections, wealth, political influence, the kind of social standing that opened doors. He hired private investigators. He wrote to congressmen. He demanded access to military files. He was polite at first, then increasingly angry, then finally broken by the reality that the machinery of government would not be moved by persistence or wealth or grief. In his final letter to the War Department, written in 1947, he asked a simple question: "Where is my daughter?" The response came months later. It was the same as before: missing, presumed captured or deceased. Investigation ongoing. No further information at this time. The investigations did continue in a perfunctory sort of way. Teams of military personnel combed through the wreckage of the war, interviewed survivors, consulted with the Red Cross, coordinated with the newly formed United Nations. They produced reports, hundreds of pages of typed documentation, cross-referenced and filed away in military archives. By 1950, 5 years after the nurses vanished, the official conclusion was reached. The nurses had been captured by German forces and presumed executed. No bodies had been found. No mass graves had been discovered. No remains existed in any camp that the Allies had liberated. But the conclusion stood: they were dead. The families could grieve. The books could be closed, files were sealed. Records were filed. The case was marked as resolved, and then in 1952, something strange happened. A researcher, a civilian historian named Dr. James Winters, was conducting independent research into nursing casualties in World War II. He had petitioned the Army to access the official files related to the missing nurses. Permission was granted, and he was given access to a secure archive facility in Washington, D.C. He spent 3 days reviewing documents, reading reports, cross-referencing testimonies, building a timeline of events. When he emerged from the archives, he had one observation that would haunt the case for decades to come. One file was missing, not misfiled, not lost in routine archival procedures, not damaged by time or neglect, simply missing from the secure facility where it had been stored. It was the master investigation file, the central repository that should have contained all the findings from the post-war inquiries. The file that would have theoretically contained the final answers. The request for its location was met with confusion, then denial, then eventually bureaucratic stonewalling. The file had been there. The file was essential to their research. But now the file could not be located. No explanation was ever offered. No investigation was launched into how a sealed military file could simply disappear from a secure archive. The matter was quietly dropped, and the mystery of the nurses deepened. In 1962, 17 years after the convoy disappeared into the fog, a woman walked into the office of the Veterans Affairs Administration in Philadelphia. She was thin, her hair had turned partially gray, and there was something fractured in the way she held herself, as if her body was present but some essential part of her remained somewhere else. Somewhere in the past, somewhere in the Belgian forest. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, Army serial number redacted. She had been listed as missing in action since February 14, 1945. She was officially dead. A closed case, a concluded investigation, but here she was, alive, real, speaking. The officials were stunned. The paperwork was amended. The case suddenly was no longer concluded. Over the following weeks, Sarah gave her testimony. She was cautious at first, her words coming slowly as if she was translating from a language spoken in trauma. But gradually the story emerged. We were in the fog. All of us, Grace, Anne, Patricia, Dorothy, all 16 of them. We didn't understand what was happening at first. The vehicles ahead of us, they seemed to stop. And then there was gunfire. German soldiers appeared out of the fog like they had been waiting for us, like they knew we were coming. Some of the drivers tried to escape. They were shot. The rest of us were pulled from the vehicles and told to stand together. I remember the cold. I remember the smell of burning diesel. I remember Patricia asking what was going to happen to us. No one answered her. They marched us into the forest. The fog was so thick we couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. We walked for hours. My feet were numb. My hands were bleeding from the cold. Around me, the other nurses were walking too, but we couldn't speak. The German soldiers would shoot anyone who tried to communicate. We ended up at a facility, a camp. It was hidden deep in the forest, a place that official records would never acknowledge, a place that the Geneva Convention seemed to have no jurisdiction over. There were other prisoners there, Allied soldiers mostly, men who had been captured in the final months of the war. The conditions were brutal. There was almost no food. The cold was suffocating. People died, not from the executions everyone feared, but from illness, from starvation, from the simple fact that the human body cannot sustain itself in such conditions. Grace tried to maintain her role as a nurse. She would share her rations with the sickest prisoners. She would tend to wounds using materials that had been salvaged from destroyed medical kits. Anne did the same. They clung to their purpose, to their identity as healers, even in a place that was designed to strip away everything that made us human. Then, in late April, as the war was collapsing around us, the Germans abandoned the camp. They just left. They took some prisoners with them. They shot others. And the rest of us were simply left there, without food, without medical supplies, in a place we had no idea how to escape from. That's when Grace made a decision. She gathered the nurses who were still alive. There were 11 of us by then. She said we had to try to reach the advancing Allies. We had to get out of the forest and into territory where the Americans were pushing forward. We walked through the snow. It was April, but it was still freezing. We had no map. We had no supplies. We had nothing but the determination to survive. Somewhere in that journey, we got separated. I was with Grace and 3 others. We were following what we thought was a road when we heard voices, American voices, soldiers from the 101st Airborne. Grace sent me forward. She told me to tell them where we were to get help. She said she would stay with the others and wait. I ran. I ran through the snow, my heart pounding, thinking for the first time in months that we might actually survive this. The soldiers took me to a field hospital. They gave me food and water and medical attention. I kept asking about the others. I kept asking about Grace and Anne and the rest of the nurses, but when the search teams went back to find them, they were gone. They found nothing. No bodies, no signs of where they had gone. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. I've spent the last 17 years trying to understand what happened. I've replayed that moment 1,000 times. I should have stayed with Grace. I should have insisted that we stay together. I should have— Sarah's voice broke here. She was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on something beyond the walls of the room. I heard their voices every night, she whispered. For years after I returned, I would be lying in bed trying to sleep and I would hear them. Grace calling my name, Anne singing the prayer we used to recite, Patricia asking why we were abandoned, Dorothy asking if anyone would ever find them. I still hear them, she said quietly. I don't think I'll ever stop. The room went silent. Sarah sat motionless, her gaze unfocused, her hands folded in her lap. The investigators waited, but no more words came. She had said what needed to be said. The rest existed only in the spaces between memory and trauma, in the territory between survival and guilt. Outside, the world continued on. Seasons changed. Years passed. But in that room, time seemed to have stopped, held suspended in the moment when one woman's salvation had cost 15 others everything. Sarah Mitchell's testimony exists in the official record now. Her voice is preserved. Her story is documented, but the larger story, the story of what happened to the other 15 nurses, remains fractured and incomplete. According to Red Cross records, over 700,000 women served in World War II, not just nurses, but in every capacity imaginable. They were pilots and mechanics, code breakers and cartographers, medics and administrators. They were the backbone of a war machine that ground across continents and oceans, and their contributions were essential to its success. And yet, when the war ended, when the victory parades filled the streets and the monuments were erected and the history books were written, those women were systematically erased. The statistics are staggering in their indifference. Official military records show that approximately 600 nurses were captured or missing in action during the war. The vast majority of these cases were eventually resolved. Bodies were recovered, prisoners were freed from camps, fates were determined and documented. But approximately 90 cases remained unsolved. 90 women whose whereabouts were never established. 90 families who never received closure. The nurses of the 121st Evacuation Hospital represent just one cluster within that larger tragedy. 16 women reduced to a footnote in military records, compressed into files that were sealed and archived and eventually forgotten. This is not an accident of history. This is not a failure of memory. This is a deliberate erasure, a choice made by institutions and governments and the machinery of war itself to prioritize bureaucratic order over human accountability. Consider the facts. When soldiers went missing, investigations were launched. When officers disappeared, inquiries were conducted. When pilots were shot down over enemy territory, rescue missions were authorized. But when nurses, medical personnel whose training and qualifications were as essential as any soldiers, vanished, the response was categorically different. The investigative files were sealed. The inquiries were conducted behind closed doors. The conclusions were reached with minimal transparency. And when families demanded answers, when historians pressed for clarity, the response was consistent. Insufficient evidence. No definitive proof. Case closed. This pattern repeats across the historical record. Women who served with courage and dedication were systematically denied the recognition afforded to their male counterparts. Women who sacrificed everything were offered paperwork instead of truth. Women who died, or in many cases were disappeared, were relegated to footnotes and statistical abstractions. The bureaucratic machinery of war created a particular kind of erasure. It did not deny the women existed. The records confirm their existence. It did not deny they served, their service is documented. But it did deny them narrative. It did deny them memory. It did deny them the fundamental human dignity of having their stories told and retold and preserved in the collective consciousness of the nation they served. Grace Holloway's locket sits in an archive now, preserved under glass. The watch with its hand stopped at 0317 has been photographed and catalogued. Sarah Mitchell's testimony has been recorded. The names of the missing nurses have been inscribed on a memorial that most people will never see. But what about the others? What about the women who were not among the fortunate few documented in survivor accounts? What about those whose names appear in no testimony because no one survived to speak for them? What about the layers of loss? Not just the loss of life, but the loss of story, the loss of memory, the loss of any acknowledgement that they ever existed at all. The war ended for soldiers on May 7, 1945. Victory was declared. The troops came home. The parades celebrated. The medals were distributed. The mythology of the war was constructed, burnished, and passed down through generations. But the war never ended for the nurses who were forgotten. Their war didn't end. It was erased. In 1998, 53 years after the nurses disappeared, a researcher was cataloging boxes of archived materials at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. The boxes had been in storage for decades, their contents never fully examined, their importance never properly assessed. Inside one of those boxes were letters. Dozens of them. Envelopes addressed to women who would never read them, sealed with wax that had grown brittle with age, posted with stamps that no longer existed, sent to women in care of military addresses that had long since been deactivated and forgotten. The letters had never been delivered. They were from families, from mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, from fiancés and childhood friends, from people who were writing to women they loved, not knowing or perhaps knowing that those letters would never arrive. Some were dated February 1945. Others came months later. Some were written years after the disappearances, by people who could not quite accept that their letters would not be answered. My dearest Grace, I pray this letter finds you well. Your father is struggling with the not knowing. He sits in your room sometimes, just looking at your nursing school diploma. I tell him you are strong, that you are taking care of yourself. I tell him you will come home. But in the nights when I am alone, I wonder if I am lying to myself. I wonder if you are warm enough. I wonder if you know how much we love you. Come home to us. Please come home. The voice reading these words came slowly, carrying the weight of decades of unanswered waiting. Anne, my little bird, it has been 2 years since we heard from you. 2 years of silence. I have your childhood drawings hung in my study. I look at them when I cannot sleep. The pictures you made of the future, the house you wanted to build, the family you wanted to have. Those dreams belonged to a girl who believed that happy endings were something that happened to people like her. I wonder if you still have those dreams. I wonder if you are still the girl I remember, or if the war has taken that from you as well. A second voice, different in tone but equal in anguish, joined the first. The two voices intertwined, creating a harmony born from shared grief. Dear Mother, I don't know if you will ever receive this, but I have to write it anyway. I have to tell you that I love you. I have to tell you that if something happens to me, it was not because I was reckless or careless. It was because I chose to be here. I chose to help. And if that choice costs me everything, then at least I will know that I died doing something that mattered. More voices began to layer in. A chorus of women speaking across decades, their words preserved in ink and paper, never received but still demanding to be heard. Mothers writing to daughters, fathers writing to the nurses they would never see again, siblings writing to sisters, lovers writing to women they had planned to marry. Each letter was a fragment. Each letter was a piece of a life interrupted. Each letter was a voice crying out across the decades, demanding acknowledgement, demanding remembrance, demanding that the silence be broken. I'm having a baby. Your nephew. I wish you could meet him. I wish I could tell you his name. I wish I could hold your hand while you held him for the first time. I saved your letters, all of them. I read them over and over. Your handwriting is fading now, the paper is yellowing, but your words are still alive. Your words are still with me. If you come home, I promise I will never ask you to relive what happened. I will never ask you to explain. I will just thank God that you are alive, and I will spend whatever time we have left making sure you know how loved you are." The voices multiplied and overlapped, creating a soundscape of collective yearning. Women writing across distance and time in the unbridgeable gap between the living and the disappeared. Each letter a heartbeat, each letter a prayer, each letter a refusal to let these women be forgotten, and then silence fell. The voices stopped. The letters remained unread by the women to whom they were addressed. Each letter was a heartbeat, stopped mid-sentence, each one a song that would never reach its intended ear, each one a love that had no place to go, so it remained here, preserved in paper and ink in archives and museums, waiting for someone to finally hear it, waiting for someone to finally acknowledge that these women had mattered, that they had been loved, that they had been real. The silence held. Arlington National Cemetery. The year is 2024. 79 years after the nurses disappeared. The memorial stands quietly among thousands of others, white marble against green grass, a rectangle of stone that contains names but no bodies. Names of women who were never brought home. Names of women whose bones lay somewhere in a Belgian forest or in a facility that was never found, or in a place so lost to history that even the archives cannot locate it. There are 16 names inscribed on the memorial, 16 women whose stories have been reduced to an 8x10 marble plaque, 16 women whose sacrifice has been minimized and marginalized, and relegated to the footnotes of a war that everyone knows about but few truly understand. Every name tells a story that will never be fully known. T. Grace Holloway. She was meant to be a teacher. She wanted to open a nursing school for girls from working-class families. Girls who didn't have the privilege or the connections to access traditional medical training. She kept a journal of ideas, sketches of curriculum, notes on how to make healthcare accessible to people who couldn't afford it. The journal was lost somewhere between Philadelphia and the Belgian forest while T.N. Carter. She was meant to be a mother. She had written to her fiancé about the house they would build, the children they would raise, the life they would create when the war ended. Her fiancé waited for her for 5 years. He eventually married someone else. He named his first daughter Anne, after the woman he could never marry. That daughter grew up hearing stories about the aunt she never met, a ghost in the family history, a woman frozen in time at the age of 27, Nurse Patricia Chen. She was the first in her family to attend university. Her parents had sacrificed everything, sold property, worked multiple jobs, denied themselves basic necessities, so that their daughter could have opportunities they never had. She wanted to return to San Francisco and establish a free clinic in the Chinese community. She kept letters from her parents written in careful English, telling her how proud they were. Those letters were never answered. Nurse Dorothy Williams. She kept a camera with her everywhere. She photographed the hospital, the patients, the daily work of being a nurse in a war zone. She had plans to write a book, a photographic essay about the women who served in the medical corps. Her final photographs, taken the day before the convoy departed, show nurses preparing supplies, tending to patients, living ordinary lives in the midst of extraordinary circumstances. Those photographs are all that remain of many of those women. They are the only visual record that they existed. The list goes on. 16 women, 16 lives interrupted, 16 futures erased. In the cemetery, visitors come and go. Some are family members, descendants of the nurses who never came home. They leave flowers. They say prayers. They touch the names carved in stone, as if through the marble they might somehow reach the women who lie beneath the earth that is not the earth where they actually rest. An elderly woman stands before the memorial. She is 78 years old. She is the great-niece of Grace Holloway. She has never met her great-aunt, but she has read all of Grace's letters. She has studied the photographs. She has listened to oral histories recorded by her grandmother, Grace's sister, who spent 70 years trying to understand what happened to the woman she loved. The woman places her hand on Grace's name. The marble is cold. The name is permanent. Everything else, the life, the dreams, the love, the sacrifice, has faded into the imprecise realm of history. Around the memorial, the world continues. Birds sing, the sun moves across the sky. Seasons change, time passes, but the names remain carved in stone. A final insistence that these women existed, that they mattered, that they deserved more than to be forgotten. They crossed an ocean to heal a wounded world. They left behind families and futures and everything they had ever known. They worked in conditions that would have been unthinkable to most people. They held the hands of dying men. They whispered comfort to soldiers who would never go home. They saved lives with their own hands, stitching wounds and distributing medicine and bringing humanity into the most inhumane of places. And when their war ended, the world simply forgot to bring them home. Some were captured, some escaped, some made it to safety, some disappeared into the fog and the forest and the machinery of war that has a way of swallowing the inconvenient and the uncomfortable, and the stories that don't fit into the narratives of triumph and victory. Their names are carved in stone now. Their legacy is preserved in archives and museums and the memories of families who refuse to let them be forgotten. Their sacrifices are acknowledged in documents and databases and the growing body of historical scholarship that is slowly reclaiming these women from the silence that tried to erase them. But that is not enough. The light they left behind, the love in the unopened letters, the dreams preserved in journals, the influence they exerted on the families that carry their names forward. That light endures. That light refuses to be extinguished. That light demands that we remember, that we acknowledge, that we never again allow the world to forget the women who crossed an ocean to heal a wounded world. The memorial stands. The names remain. The story continues. And somewhere in the collective memory of a nation, these women are finally coming home.